Each of us carries a unique set of genetic information. 99.9% of DNA sequences are identical in all people on Earth. The remaining 0.1% is what makes each of us unique. It encodes our facial features, predispositions to diseases, temperament traits, and even the way we perceive taste. But DNA is also a chronicle of events. It holds traces of the past, disasters, survival stories, great migrations, wars, and other upheavals. You might know nothing about your distant ancestors, but your cells remember everything. And the most amazing part is that scientists have learned to read these traces. And one day, they discovered something that sent chills down their spines. Many of us carry the marks of the most ruthless purging in human history. And yet, it was also the most silent. We knew nothing about it until recently. What was this horrifying massacre that makes both world wars of the 20th century pale in comparison? And why isn't it mentioned in history textbooks? What wiped out 95% of men 5,000 years ago? To understand what happened, we need to dig a little deeper into genetics. Be cool. Don't tune out. This is actually fascinating. Here's the thing. Inside you lives an entire archive of family records. Not photos and postcards, but pieces of code. One of these is mitochondrial DNA. It's passed down to both sons and daughters, strictly through the maternal line. The second type is the Y-chromosome, which is passed down only from fathers to sons. And this is where things get interesting. When scientists compared the DNA of modern humans, they noticed something strange. The genes from mothers are all different, but the Y chromosome, passed from fathers to sons, is almost identical. Practically clone after clone. This points to a disturbing realization. At some point in the past, our planet's male population almost went extinct. It happened between 5,000 and 7,000 years ago. Up to 95% of all male bloodlines were cut off. They simply disappeared, as if those men had never existed. No descendants, no traces in the DNA. Take a look at the diagram. On the left is the Y chromosome graph, which represents male lineages. You can clearly see a sharp drop there. The right diagram represents the mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down the maternal line. It remains stable without such a collapse. In other words, female lineages resemble a sprawling tree with many living branches, while male lineages look like a bush with almost all its branches cut off. To grasp how shocking this is, imagine a global catastrophe that selectively wipes out the male population, leaving about 200 million men out of today's 4 billion. At the same time, nearly all women survive. This would mean about 1 man for every 20 women. Entire villages, maybe even cities, would be predominantly female, with just a handful of men who would become the ancestors of future generations. And this didn't happen in just one place. The reduction in male genetic diversity occurred across Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and surrounding regions. This isn't just unusual, it's unnatural. It defies everything we know about how nature works. Could a natural disaster be the cause? But a volcanic eruption, a global drought, or an asteroid impact, none of these events would be so selective. Nature doesn't target men, it kills indiscriminately, regardless of chromosomes. Everyone would have died. What about war? There have been some horrific conflicts throughout human history, and the most brutal ones indeed claimed the lives of men first. World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, claimed roughly 70 to 85 million lives, about 3% of the global population at that time. Around 80% of those killed were men. That's about 5% of the planet's male population at the time. Even this colossal bloodbath didn't wipe out 95% of male lineages. Whatever happened between 5,000 and 7,000 years ago was much more extensive and much more mysterious. What was this massive, horrifying massacre that we know nothing about? Could it have been some kind of disease? Again, we don't know of any viruses that exclusively kill men. The Black Death wiped out 30% to 60% of Europe's population, both men and women alike. Humanity has survived ice ages, volcanic winters, and deadly pandemics. These events have certainly left genetic scars, but across both male and female lines. However, the disappearance of 95% of men is a whole different story, and a much harder one to explain. But this isn't the only time a sharp reduction in population numbers, along with the loss of vast amounts of unique genetic variants, occurred. Scientists call this a bottleneck effect. Something similar happened to humanity around 900,000 years ago. We covered this in detail in another video, and it has happened to other species as well. Cheetahs are a striking example. After a severe population crash tens of thousands of years ago, today's cheetahs are almost genetically identical. So much so that they can even have skin grafts from each other without immune rejection. They are practically clones. But forget about cheetahs. The real question is, why was there a selective pressure targeting specifically one part of humanity, men? What really happened? The answer might be lying right beneath our feet, literally, and it's horrifying, almost bone-chilling. Archaeologists are uncovering ancient mass graves all over the world, dated to between 7,000 and 5,000 years ago. A particularly high number of such sites is found in Europe. Inside them, bodies with fractured skulls and severed arms, and all of them date to roughly the same period, when the male gene pool began to drastically collapse. It was the late Neolithic. At that time, people were already living in settlements, building fences, and, apparently, waging fierce wars against each other. Talheim, Germany. Something terrible happened here around 5000 BC. Archaeologists found the remains of 34 people. All of them died almost simultaneously. What's alarming is the complete absence of any signs of defense. The people hadn't fought back. They were caught while fleeing, struck from behind or in the back of the head. No one even managed to turn around. They were caught and beaten to death. Their skulls were smashed open, a single blow, and emptiness. Some had an arrow lodged directly into their spine, while others were killed with stone axes. This wasn't a battle. It wasn't even a hunt. It was pure extermination. And the researchers immediately noticed something strange and suspicious. Specifically, who died such a brutal death? There were 16 men, 9 women, 7 children, including infants, and 2 adolescents whose sex could not be determined. In other words, there were nearly twice as many dead men as women. But the most important thing is that there were almost no young women of childbearing age among them. It's assumed that the attackers took them. What was this? Revenge? Looting? Or the first episode of a large-scale drawn-out war? Alright, you might say 34 people isn't enough to draw conclusions. But that's just the beginning. What follows is much, much darker. Schletz, Lower Austria, near Aspern an der See. At this excavation site, the picture became even grimmer. It was another mass grave dating to the same period of around 5000 BC. But this time, there were about 200 bodies. Among them, there were almost no women or teenagers. Instead, there were numerous men with broken limbs, severed arms, and legs. They weren't just killed. Their arms and legs were smashed, shoulder joints torn out, bones crushed as if pounded with hammers. Some skulls were found separately from the bodies. It's safe to say these victims were tortured. Could this still have been part of a massive conflict? At the time, people lived in tiny communities, but if dozens of such groups wiped each other out, the scale would amount to a real war. And if you think it couldn't get any worse, you'd be wrong. Because the next site isn't just a battlefield, it's a nightmare. Even women were not spared here. In fact, that's putting it mildly. What was seen here rendered even experienced archaeologists speechless. What was happening back then is closer to a horror movie than a history textbook. Imagine a community of cannibals. The victims' bodies were dissected in the most gruesome ways to reach the most nutritious parts, the tongue and the brain. And the bones were used to make tools or decorative artifacts, with skulls being especially prized. How is that for an atmosphere? Welcome to Germany, 5000 BC. Herxheim, the most sinister place on the map of that era. Here, archaeologists uncovered 80 pits containing the remains of hundreds of people, possibly up to 1,500 individuals. Almost all of them had their scalps removed, bones broken, and skulls cut open. And here, in this place, there was no distinction, men, women, and children alike. It's hard to comprehend, and even harder to explain. It was some kind of madness, and we've only visited 3 locations showing traces of this insanely brutal time. In total, there are already over 200 such sites across Europe. And seems like there will be more places uncovered soon. Most of these sites tell the same story. It was predominantly men who perished, and in overwhelming numbers. And the strangest part is that all of these sites belong to the same period, when the male Y-chromosome began to disappear from history on a massive scale. If all this is just a coincidence, then why is it so consistent? Why do they occur across Europe almost at the same time? At this point, it's no longer just a pattern. It's an explosion, a wave, and the scale is so vast that it starts to resemble some ancient forgotten war. Perhaps the very first major war in human history? And once again, we can't stress this enough. It wasn't confined to European civilization. It swept across the entire globe, almost completely eradicating the male gene pool. At first glance, everything seems to fit. Mass graves, traces of violence, the disappearance of male lineages, even the timelines match, between 5,000 and 7,000 years ago. But here's the problem. All this happened among peoples who didn't even know about each other and never came into contact. Some were farmers, others hunters. Some had stone axes, others copper daggers. Different cultures, different rituals, different motives. So no, while epic, the hypothesis of a global war is wrong. Scientists dismissed it almost immediately. But then, what actually happened? The first hypothesis is close to the idea of a great war, but not quite. They are called extreme wars. Soon, it will become clear what made them so extreme. Some scholars believe that during the Neolithic era, an age of bloody interclan conflicts began. Small male clans constantly fought each other for land, food, and other resources. And during those brutal times, women also became a resource in such wars. Here's the key point. If a clan lost, all its men were killed, and the women were taken. These weren't just wars, they were purges, wiping out every last male of the defeated side. In such wars, surrender wasn't an option. You couldn't pledge loyalty to another clan. You either won or you died. And woe to the defeated. The entire Y-chromosome line would vanish forever. That's why these wars are called extreme. Here's how it worked. All the men of a clan likely shared the same Y-chromosome, inherited from a common ancestor. After all, that's what defined a clan. So by wiping out a clan, you erased an entire genetic line from history, with no chance for return. But there's a caveat. This wasn't one giant war. There wasn't a global Neolithic massacre. Rather, it was many local conflicts flaring up again and again across different regions. Sometimes it looked like a raid, sometimes a show of force, and at times even a senseless bloodbath. The exterminations repeated over and over, and so the Y-chromosomes of the defeated disappeared, slowly but systematically, one after another. Many skeptics ask, if the hypothesis of such a bloody past is true, where's the evidence? Where are the thousands of bodies with fractures, puncture wounds, and signs of brutal battles? Sure, we've found some burial sites at Talheim, Schletz, and Herxheim. But if the carnage was that massive, shouldn't such places be everywhere? The answer may be much more prosaic, and much more frightening. It's not about the absence of tragedies, but about anatomy and time. Only about 15% of wounds from sharp weapons, such as knives, spears, and axes, leave any marks on bones. The rest simply vanishes forever. The vast majority of injuries affect soft tissues, and even more losses happen after the battle. Death from infection, sepsis, blood loss, hypothermia, or starvation. These deaths were massive and painful, but absolutely invisible to paleogenetics. So the absence of evidence doesn't necessarily mean absence of violence. It's possible we are only seeing the tip of the iceberg. Does it sound like a reasonable explanation? Yes, but it's not the only one. Because there's another theory about events far quieter than wars, yet no less dangerous, and that's what we'll explore next. Some scholars wondered, what if it wasn't just about axes, arrows, and the brutal customs of the time? Maybe we've been too focused on the massacres, while the real reason lies in the structure of the societies themselves. There's a very compelling hypothesis. We mentioned earlier that the clans were patrilineal. It's a complicated word, but the idea is simple. Everything at the time was inherited through the male line. Land, status, the house, and the right to take part in decisions were all passed from father to son. Women, on the other hand, could move between communities, but men stayed with their clan for life. They couldn't leave it, simply by design. What does this mean for genetics? All the men within a clan were blood relatives. They shared the same Y-chromosome. If the clan lived peacefully and thrived, their male line continued. But if the clan suffered disaster for any reason, not just war, then all its men would perish, and with them their Y-chromosome would disappear. Because they couldn't simply join another clan. Women could, and did, so their mitochondrial DNA survived and continued to be passed down to both boys and girls. But the Y-chromosome? Gone. Broken. One lineage wiped out. Now imagine, there were hundreds of such clans, and if clan after clan was lost this way, the male genetic pool would collapse, irreversibly. Only the lines of those clans that either won or successfully assimilated others would survive. There's another hypothesis, not about the clans themselves, but about the competition within them. Just like in the animal world, only the most dominant males were allowed to reproduce. If just one man in a community fathered children while the others didn't, then the entire genetic future of the clan depended on a single individual. Take a look at lions, for example. When a lion takes over a pride, he kills all the cubs of the previous alpha males and mates with the females. Only those in power pass on their genes. Everyone else is out of the game. Gorillas and chimpanzees show a similar pattern. If you win the hierarchy battle, your genome lives on. If you lose, you survive, but your genetic line disappears. Things would change drastically if a similar harsh social stratification developed in Neolithic communities. Just imagine, within a clan, there are 20 men, but only 2 to 3 of the most influential ones have offspring. The rest are simply part of the community. They live, work, fight, but their genes are a dead-end branch. Now stretch that over hundreds of generations, and you get the so-called genetic bottleneck. Not because everyone was killed, but because almost no one passed down their male line. And it happened selectively. Are there precedents? Yes. One particularly striking example is Genghis Khan, the Mongol conqueror of the 13th century. According to some estimates, about 8% of all men in Asia today carry his Y chromosome. That's millions of descendants from a single dominant male. The ultimate alpha male in history. This hypothesis explains the disappearance of 95% of male lineages in a peaceful but ruthless way, through social selection. It's like genetic feudalism. If you didn't make it to the top, your genetic line came to an end. There's even a climate-based theory to explain this eerie anomaly in human genetic history. Some researchers have noticed that under extreme conditions, especially during cold periods, fewer boys are actually born. There are even studies tracking this statistically, so maybe something similar happened here. It sounds logical until you look at the dates. Let's remember that this genetic bottleneck occurred around 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, and the last major cooling event that could have affected populations took place 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. So no, that doesn't fit. Then what? Finally, there are biological hypotheses. For instance, epidemics that could have selectively affected male fertility. And no, this isn't science fiction. Such viruses exist even today. For instance, the mumps virus can cause male infertility. If there was something similar in ancient times, the explanation could be surprisingly simple. Maybe men didn't die off en masse, they simply failed to leave descendants. The problem is that scientists have no direct evidence of such epidemics from that period, but the possibility can't be ruled out either, especially if we're not talking about one massive pandemic, but a series of smaller, recurring outbreaks. Individually, they might not have been catastrophic enough to be remembered and passed down through generations, but they could still have left their mark, possibly. There are many theories, but one fact remains. And it's important to make another clarification here. When you hear 95% of male lineages disappeared, the mind immediately pictures some kind of global massacre, as if the entire Earth had been drowned in blood, billions killed, screams heard, battles and catastrophes raging everywhere. But in reality, it's more complicated. Don't think that 95% of all men were killed. It's about the disappearance of their Y-chromosome lines. They might have lived, worked, fought, but left no sons, or their sons left no sons. To better understand what this means, imagine 1,000 men living in one region. All of them carry different Y-chromosomes. A few generations later, only 100 remain, then just 50. The rest have disappeared, not because they were all slaughtered in one day, but because their sons didn't have sons. One died in battle, another never started a family, a third one only had daughters. Step by step, the Y-chromosomes simply vanished. Or picture a large city with 1 million residents, and after centuries, only 1 in 20 men has male line descendants. The rest simply faded into history, no graves, no traces. So when we say 95% disappeared, it's more about the gene pool. And in some ways, that makes it even more chilling, because it all happened quietly, invisibly, with no chance of return. And yet, the bottleneck was not the end. It was just a turning point in history. Just 1,000 to 2,000 years later, after the mysterious collapse, Y-chromosome genetic diversity began to recover. Why? Something in society had changed, slowly, almost imperceptibly. The rigid hierarchies began to crack, the boundaries between clans blurred, and marriages started happening between communities that had once been isolated. Wars didn't vanish, but they happened less often. And according to researchers, it is this combination of factors that gave new male lines a chance to survive. No one really knows what exactly happened before that. Maybe half of men did fall in battles, or maybe they simply never became fathers. Perhaps violence was at fault, or perhaps social isolation, where only the insiders married and continued their lineage, while outsiders were out of the running. But this isn't the end of the story. Every new archaeological find could overturn everything we thought we knew about this era. So the questions remain, and we still don't have all the answers. The one thing we know for certain is this: something happened. Something so devastating that its echo can still be found today in every carrier of the Y chromosome on the planet.